So one of the things that we're going to need to cover before we really get into dealing with a bunch of different plant families at the level that we're going to for the rest of the time is to talk about plant taxonomy and classification. Now we've mentioned some of these things in lab here and there, but there are a few more background issues that will really help you, I think, to learn plant families a little bit better. Now we've been using a bunch of plant names, and a big part of what you're doing in lab is learning plant names and the correct identification of those plants with their names. And people have asked, like, why don't we use common names? And I've probably said something really flippant like, oh, common names really suck, they're impossible to learn and remember. And sometimes they're useful because they've got a particular trait to them where regionally they can be really informative, but they've got a bunch of downsides too. So typically people who are real serious about identifying things and being on the same page about different species will try to stick to scientific names. And so if we're dealing with common names, they can be helpful, but they can also be real confusing. So here are some examples. Here is a plant that's, we would typically think of as a cedar. And so eastern red cedar could be what this plant is, and so we would call that cedar. There are other things, another plant called incense cedar, which grows in a very different region of the world, yet still called cedar. And then there's western red cedar, which are some of these enormous, enormous trees that occur in the Pacific Northwest, also called cedar. There's Atlantic white cedar, which grows in more northern hemispheres along the east coast. And then there's things called Spanish cedar. So we have a bunch of different things called cedar. They all go by a similar common name. There's the cedars of Lebanon that were featured in the Bible. All those different examples that I've just flipped through really quickly are in 3 different plant families. And as we'll see later, these plant families are, they're somewhat related, but they're fairly distantly related. So to call things the same common name when they can be in multiple different families tends to be fairly confusing. So instead, people tend to try to deal with family, genus, and species when you're dealing, specific epithet, when you're dealing with plant names and plant taxonomy. Here's some other examples of why common names aren't very useful. There's a particular plant known as the European white lily, and it has at least 245 different common names. So 2 people could be talking about the exact same plant but call it 2 very different things, and they wouldn't be able to communicate at all. Marsh marigold, the picture on the right here, has at least 280 different common names. So it would be impossible for people in 2 different regions, maybe even 2 different townships, to be referring to the same plant with 2 very different names unless they were agreeing on a scientific naming system. So where do we get our system of classification from? Well, currently we've talked about this a little bit in lab. So we've got a genus or a generic name, which is usually a descriptor of some aspect of the plant. So we'll take the coffee plant. Coffea is a Latinized form of the Arabic word for beverage. So coffea means beverage. This is the beverage genus. And then the specific name or the specific epithet is typically an adjective that describes a member of that genus, so specifically this kind of plant. So Arabica, in this case, Arabica, this lineage of plant was first described from Arab regions of the world. So the complete name for the plant that we get coffee from is Coffea arabica with an L on the end. And now that L is the person or the authority who first named that species. We don't have to get into the naming of species, although I have to say I was involved in a podcast a few years ago that was really fascinating, I think, a descriptor of how new plants or new species in general are named. And if you're interested, I can share that with you. So the naming of a species is a pretty difficult and time-intensive task. It's a full description of the whole entire species, and Linnaeus did a ton of them. on top of lots of other things that we'll briefly talk about. So in this case, Linnaeus has described so many different things that we don't even bother writing out the full name. The authority right here, when we have Coffea arabica, the L here, the authority is just abbreviated as Linnaeus, and we all know, hey, that's Linnaeus who did that one. So scientific names usually point out some things that are useful about the plant, and that's why I've tried to emphasize in lab a list of, hey, this scientific name has a meaning because it can help you remember some aspects of that plant. So we'll take another one. This is a European thistle. The genus is Cirsium, from the Greek cirsos, meaning swollen vein. And the specific epithet is horridulum, which means prickly. So this is literally, if you were to take the description and put it together, it would be the prickly plant that cures swollen veins, and it was used as a medicinal. It was originally described by André Michaux, so the correct scientific name, fully laid out with authority and everything, would be Cirsium horridulum Michaux. Now, in lab, I am not asking you to write these things down when you are identifying a species. You don't have to give me the authority. But when you are doing your plant collections on iNaturalist and you're filling out that table, I will ask you to put that information in place. So you can look that information up, though. You don't need to memorize it. Another example of what a scientific name often means. The genus and species names often tell you something about the plant, like its appearance, something maybe about the common name. They might indicate some kind of chemical that's produced by the plant that's useful for people, or might reflect how the plant tastes or smells. So in this particular case, this cucumber, Cucurbita fetidissima, you can imagine that it doesn't smell very good, because it doesn't. Fetid means smelly or stinky. The common name may also tell you, the scientific name may also tell you a little bit about how the plant grows, like is it viney, is it prostrate, meaning it lies down, etc. Just a couple more examples. And these are interesting botanical examples. Erythroxylum coca. Erythro means red. Xylo means wood, so this is a plant with red stems, as you can see in the slide here. Coca, the species common name, is how it's referred to by people of South America, where Erythroxylum coca is native. Coca is the common name of the plant, so that's how people refer to it, Erythroxylum coca. Here's another one that's really interesting that you might get to see later on in the season, Asclepias tuberosa, again described by Linnaeus. That's what that little L means. So Asclepius is the Greek god of medicine, Asclepios. Tuberosa means tubiferous, which refers to the root system, and again, Linnaeus is the authority there. This is one of my favorite plants, Calocarpa americana. Calocarpa, from the Greek kalos, meaning beauty, and karpos, meaning fruit. Americana means it was discovered in America. And so literally the name of this plant is the beautiful fruit of America. And it is a real pretty plant. It will set fruit like this in the summer and late fall. The common name for this plant is beautyberry. So all these things sort of hang together and make some amount of sense. I want to touch upon a couple others, ones that you might see as you're out in the field, just like Calocarpa. So we have Coreopsis lanceolata. Coreopsis is from the Greek chorus, meaning bug, and opsis, meaning looks like. So the achenes, the little seeds from this plant, look like tiny little bugs. So Coreopsis, everything in that genus Coreopsis has tiny little seeds that look like bugs. Lanceolata means lance-shaped, so that describes the image of the leaves. And again, the authority, Linnaeus. Cornus drumundii. Now, not everybody pronounces both I's, but that's the correct pronunciation for something that ends in two I's, like drumundii here. So, Cornus drumundii It's from the Latin cornu, meaning horn or hard or tough. The wood of all dogwoods are very, very tough. This is a dogwood. Drummondii, named after Thomas Drummond, who was a botanist. Sometimes different species get named after particular authorities or just people who are funny or interesting or in the news. There's several plants named after Stephen Colbert. There's lots of plants named after characters from comic strips, all sorts of things. People will give scientific names to all sorts of species for a variety of funny reasons. Um, so given that this is Cornus Drummondii, the actual sort of translation of the plant name might be Drummond's horny plant, or maybe Drummond's plant with really hard stems. A couple other things that you're likely to see illustrated here by Catalpa speciosa. First of all, Catalpa is a Native American word, so when the authorities named this plant originally, they took into account the Native American name for this plant. Catalpa, incidentally, is the same root word as Cahaba and Catawba. So if you've heard of course, the Cahaba River, all of these come from a very similar word origin in Native American language. Speciosa, you'll see that for lots of species. Speciosa doesn't mean a species, instead it means showy or good looking. So this is the showy or good looking Catalpa. And the authority that you might see on the end is got Warder in parentheses and then Warder et Engelmann, and then it's abbreviated. So it was originally discovered or named by Warder, but it was modified by Engelmann, and so we sort of recognize all of these authorities. Now, when you are putting your names into your collection, iNaturalist collection, you should put all of this stuff, and all of this stuff will be listed on lots of websites that's easy to look up. I want to real briefly talk about the role that Linnaeus played in generating our naming system. It used to be that a particular plant, like for example this mint, was a long list of Latin names. And if you think the names that we've got to memorize and remember now are difficult, think of how difficult this would be. So the particular plant called spearmint used to be Mentha floribus spicatus folius oblongus serratus. So that's a pretty long description of the plant, but it would mean here's a mint, it's got flowers and a spike, leaves are oblong and soft-toothed. So it's more of a description than it is actually a name. Now, a lot of people credit Linnaeus with coming up with the naming system of species, and he did, but he mostly modified. Most of our great advances in science are not out of nowhere. They're just great modifications, really good ideas where someone has built on another system. So what Linnaeus did was simplified that whole thing and said, look, we've got to stick with two names. And so he simplified it to Mentha spicata. Everything else in the world, when we name a species, two names, the genus name and the specific epithet. So I'm not going to go through all these things that Linnaeus did, but there's a couple interesting tidbits here. Super productive guy, wrote a lot of things, described thousands and thousands of species. But when it came to plants, he focused on the sexual classification system. So a lot of the traits of plants that really help us identify them are based on their sexually reproductive, unique traits. Their flowers, their floral arrangements, and their seeds or fruits. So, like many people of his time, he was pretty interested in sex and describing sex and using sex as a way of describing different things. Now this is a little bit of trivia. You can pause on this slide or just look at the slides that you download from Moodle. There's a lot of really interesting, quirky things here. They classified species based on a rather old understanding of how individuals were in relationships. So for example, are these plants in public marriages? In other words, are the flower parts visible to everyone? Are they in one bed? where husband and wife have the same bed, or are they um, polyandrous with some males above other males? There's a lot of weird terminology in how they describe the floral parts of these plants that then turned into something having to do with the scientific name. So some of the scientific names that you see are going to seem really weird and bizarre, but there really was some method and some rationale for why they were using the system that they used and the naming that they used. I've mentioned this in class, but I want to real briefly highlight it again. When Linnaeus was describing a lot of things that were discovered in North America, this would have been a map of North America at about the time when Linnaeus was describing species. And you can see that a lot of states hadn't fully been formed. So anything with Alabamensis, there was no Alabama at that time. But according to Linnaeus, he sort of grouped things together into three major regions of the New World, or the Americas. It was Canadensis, which is anything sort of north of Massachusetts. There's Virginiana, which is kind of the middle east coast of the United States, and then Caroliniana, which is everything from sort of the Carolinas on downward, including what would later on become Florida. So when you see Canadensis, Virginiana, etc., doesn't necessarily mean that it only came from Canada or only came from Virginia, but what it means is it was originally collected from some particular region. All right, don't get too blown away by this, but there's one kind of take home. This is a mess. There are a lot of different systems for describing plants, and Linnaeus wasn't the be-all end-all. Lots of people modified what he did, and then we started using DNA to separate species and get a better understanding of their relationships. And given that lots and lots of plants have gone extinct, we're missing a lot of pieces and connections between species. So the punchline, the take home that you should get from this image is, wow, characterizing and classifying plants is so difficult that it's taken dozens and dozens of really great minds over hundreds of years, thousands of years, to get where we are today, and it is still a work in progress. This is a very difficult thing to try to classify plants and understand their relationships and their names. So keep that in mind when we're trying to learn a scientific name of one species that actually gets changed to another species that gets changed to another species later on. A lot of these things are provisional, these names are provisional, and we're still trying to work out some of the distinctions and the relationship. So let's talk very broad scale about how things are classified, because again, this is not just useless trivia, but I think it will be something that will help you remember some species a little bit better, and also identify things a little bit better. So in terms of botany, you're probably familiar with the idea of phyla, of taxonomic phyla, but in terms of botany, botanists tend to think of things in divisions. So there are lots of divisions, and these would be kind of the lowest level of classification here in this image. These divisions include up to 3 things that are bryophytes, and we'll talk about what those things are. There are at least 4 of these things that are seedless plants, 4 that are gymnosperms, and 1 division that is angiosperms. So at the broadest level of plant taxonomy, you've got those different kinds of groups. As you zoom in a little bit more and go from division to class to subclass, etc., you get finer and finer scales of resolution. What that's reflecting is typically phylogenetic relationships. So as much as possible, we try to stick to a reliable phylogenetic relationship which characterizes these real, or as real as we think they are, groupings of plants based on relatedness. So you're familiar probably with the list on the left. I talked about it briefly in lab. So, King Philip. Kevin, please come over. for great spaghetti, for example. But there are a couple other things that are added in there, like the division, subclass, and subspecies, which we probably will not cover. So this is the typical order that you're used to. How does that map onto this phylogenetic tree? There's division level splits that are very basal to this tree. There's class level splits as you get farther and farther towards the tip of the tree. Things like asterids, these represent subclasses, which are kind of in between classes and orders. And then finally we've got at the tips of this phylogeny, we've got different orders. Now, that may or may not mean anything to you, and if it doesn't mean anything to you, that's fine. I'm not going to ask you to memorize where those things fall on the phylogenetic tree. The idea behind me showing you this now is that when you take a plant, it has a spot, it has a location within this series of order. So we could take one place right here, Lamiales. We've got the mints. The mints are actually, that order is going to be related to Solanales, which include the tomatoes. So they've got a lot of similarities. Rosales and Fabales, those things will have some similarities because of identity by descent. This particular map, this phylogenetic relationship, is one that I'm going to rely on a bunch as we go through a bunch of important or top families in the next several videos. So you'll probably get used to seeing this phylogenetic relationship over and over and over again. Right now, just recognize that it exists and recognize that it's something that I'm going to be using in the future. You don't have to memorize anything from it. So if we take a particular plant and you look up this plant maybe on Wikipedia or something like that, you might find that it has a full listing of which kingdom, subkingdom, class, etc. it all fits in. What I'm interested in from your standpoint from the lab and from your being able to identify things is to deal with family, genus, and species. And as I've said before, families always end in EAE, and the species name includes both the genus and the specific epithet. You've probably heard the term taxa or taxon. These refer to just anything across any level. So you could talk about the taxa of the Asteraceae. You could talk about the taxa of the Plantae. So taxa is just sort of a generic term at any level here. Lots of taxa, one taxon.